The story you are about to hear came to me in a dream. Or have these people simply returned from a long-forgotten, sleeping memory? The Scarlet Thread. Chapter 1. The Court. The die was cast, as with all men, but clouds didn't part, the elements made no mention, and the town took no notice, initially. Will Templeton was a usual boy, though not quite as common as had been hoped for, and that to the chagrin of some, no less his parents. At 15, he stood unusually large for his age, and narrow for his size, yet broad in scope and scuff. A mean streak was far from his mettle, though iron might melt before the resolve of this boy. His mother would say he had his grandmother's stubborn disposition. His father would agree, and so they supposed he was not to be blamed. Not every citizen of Twin Forks, Ohio, was entirely forgiving, as the afternoon of September 14th, 1889, so proved. Will looked down at his respectable shoelaced feet, as the room looked down on him. Never was he quite able to fill his father's shoes. Now, least of all. He shuffled and invented a pattern on the floor with his swirling toes. Beside them, on the purposely uncomfortable wooden bench, dangled the feet of one sympathetic in cut and groove, the less gangled, yet no less entangled, Geoffrey Asher. Something of an outcast himself, and impeccably dressed. Master Asher fed the flames of Master Templeton's misdemeanors on more than one occasion. This being no exception, the two sat in wait of a verdict. Mid-afternoon sun shone on the magistrate's face, illuminating his countenance as one befitting a throne. A man who preferred to skim rather than fully read, he knew little of much. He was as frighteningly serious of his law as of his loins, both of which he kept contented. The midday was waning, and he knew instinctively that a meal was not far off. Magistrate Hodgkins could feel a pork roast somewhere ahead, and his palate rejoiced. Then someone spoke. Looking somewhat compressed and contentedly misshapen in resentful ways was the plaintiff, one Mr. Bill Nunes. When called, he rose and reenacted the scene of how he was, without cause or provocation, shot by Will Templeton. "Winged just above the elbow was he." The boys were, it seems, on the afternoon of August 27th, hunting in a wooded area known as Simon's Pass, in chase of an edible bird. The bird, equally unaware of Nunes' presence, landed over a particular briar patch behind which Nunes was squatting for some unknown reason. Now, both parties in pursuit of such hotly contested fast food were bound to meet unfavorably, and so they did. Nunes, upon having the grouse land in his lap, grabbed that bird by the neck and the wing like the find of the century, and in one jerking motion from his predatory crouch, hoisted his prize overhead. The boys, William in lead, rifle in hand, in full run, then willfully and maliciously, as it was asserted, shot at Mr. Nunes, puncturing his right arm. The victim, then, having sufficiently vented his ever-wronged spleen, sank back to his seat, clutching Exhibit A. A for arm. Will grinned to himself, proud that he had actually hit such a spindly target. It was his turn to speak. He thought it a treat. Rarely was he given the floor. Frequently was he given the strap. His father, being the village barber, had a goodly supply of leather straps and an adept wrist at a close shave. Ever curious but naive of consequence, Will was a fish seeking a hook, just to see where the line would take him. The willowy teen arose and spoke his piece. He was deliberate, unaffected, and unafraid. Well, sort of. Both he and Jeff knew they were innocent. It had been an accident, what with the bird popping up behind the bush. He just didn't know and couldn't tell in the brambles and flapping that there was a fella attached to it. And besides, he maintained, most men hunt on foot, upright with rifles, not a creepin' and a chasin' like an animal hisself. Who'd have suspected it? Truer words were never spoken, leastwise not in this courtroom. The hermit from the hedge scowled. Mostly he was upset at losing face, the grouse, and of course a perfectly good sleeve. A perfectly good grouse. With a grunt, the magistrate returned his attention to the courtroom. Curling his whiskers and hoping no one had noticed his own desired pursuit of the bird, he had heard quite enough. He would make a decision. He, too, then arose and retired to his chambers, where libations were present and justice flowed freely. The boys looked at each other, then stared at the silent wooden chamber door. Their parents stared at them. The courtroom stared at his parents. Bill Noon stared at his victimized arm, and behind the door, the magistrate, with eyes fully closed, reclined and sipped in silence. Some time later, the door opened with a decisive swish. The courtroom stood as the judge flowed all a-robed to his appointed podium, 6 inches above the earthly rest of them. He cleared his throat, and with a voice warmed and deepened, said, "Not guilty." The boys broke into a cheer. The crowd made various noises of varying sensibility. "But," he said. The room silenced, and Will just knew there'd be a big but in there if Hodgkins was attached to it. "But there will be certain conditions. Both of you are most assuredly not guilty of attempted murder, but you are guilty of undeniable damages and must compensate your innocent victim. The 2 of you are to work in the service of the plaintiff without payment, providing no less than 12 grouse or other reasonable eating birds per month for a period of 2 months, to be delivered to the town coffers for the plaintiff's consumption or sale in repayment for the loss of his dinner, his sleeve, and attendant misery associated with the injury, and so forth and so on. After a period of 2 months, being the end of grouse season, you will theretofore be released from the service of the plaintiff, and will report back to this courtroom with no less than 3 freshly killed and clean grouse for examination by and forfeiture to this court." He hammered his gavel, and it was done. Will secretly wondered at Seymour Hodgkins' lung capacity, what with being able to get all of that out in one blast of official breath. And so justice would apparently be served with potatoes, cream sauce, and mint jelly. The bailiff patted Will's shoulder and escorted the boys to the oaken courtroom door and conditional freedom. "Looks like you've got a friend somewhere up there, lads. Goodness knows you've got enough detractors down here, eh?" With a "thank you, sir," at his half-cocked, toothy grin, they turned, and in turn each shook his thick clamp of a hand, and so ended their day in court, with the bailiff's half-smile, crooked in relief, somehow overshadowed by his custodial brow, knit in concern. They say the Irish are born lucky. Fortunately, William's mother is distantly Irish, and that, he supposed, entitled him to luck, at least half of the time. The English, on the other hand, are born with rules, as was his father, and that, he discovered, meant falling under the weight of those rules the rest of the time. This episode granted Will a little of both. Tomorrow at sunup they would begin their payment for discharge. Actually, he reasoned, this was a blessing in disguise. Now, not only could he spend as much time as he wished hunting and generally outdoors in the pass, but they had been quite ordered by a judge to do so. No parent in the world could dare say a word against that. Yes, he most certainly had a friend somewhere. Across the river, and 8 blocks away, in fact, lived his one worldly companion. But they were most significant blocks where Twin Forks was concerned. The town was naturally separated into east and west by the Wahani River and the weight of several generations. The east may have been the moon as far as those on this side were concerned. For high-profile citizens, there was no crossing. For the boys, there was no stopping. Boys, you see, have an uncanny ability, like streams of water, of finding each other. Forbidden places possess a lure, and Will Templeton possesses a skiff. On nights when the moon was bold enough to see by, young William had, once or twice, quietly slipped away from his warm blankets, his inviting open window, and his parents' closed eyes. There was no need for a tree limb or a harrowing escape, for just below his bedroom window awaited the angular tool-shed roof. He need only slide down and away to a new land. Will's daytime truancies could be attributed elsewhere. His great-uncle Desmond on his father's side. He had known Uncle Des briefly before his passing, and had come to unrepentantly adore the crusty old man. Desmond was something of an explorer, a trader, a pioneer, an expeditionary, and a man of more tales than a raccoon hat company. He had in time searched for gold in the southern continent when everyone else was north. He'd bagged fur from beaver, fox, rabbit, coon, and black bear in, he said, the unclaimed frozen Northland. But Will loved the old man's stories and his sand. Desmond talked about the old ways before the memory or sight of anyone still living, things long ago passed only from quill to parchment or father to son. In a world of souls who are either warriors or merchants, William's own father was very much the merchant. A humble man, a quiet man, stern but fair, he was a respected business holder who provided for his family and his family's name. Whereas Uncle Des, with all he had garnered in life, had obtained no family of his own, neither wife nor child, only a smoky, gray, white, and willful cat, and a small house filled with large maps, aging books, and captured memories. A man's house remains as a harbor for his restlessness and a catalogue of his life. But to Will it was treasure above all else, a home for Vikings. Desmond regarded the land itself as his cot, and the sea of stars his canopy. Will would remember what Desmond had taught him about hunting and tracking, about being guided by the placement of the sun and the moss on trees. And more, he would remember something he had not understood. At times, strange times, quiet times for a blustery man, Desmond would reach into his breast pocket and remove something that never left his guard. There, tucked and folded away, was a small broken twig he'd taken from a tree just before leaving England. He kept it close all his years, wrapped in care and a well-creased, strangely beloved silken handkerchief. This swath of cloth had a single red cord sewn along its edge and running its circumference. Will secretly thought the man had held the odd keepsake with more sanctity, more protection than his mother regards even her wedding ring. The boy knew neither of its significance nor of its value to the unmatched man. But Will knew that in those fleeting moments he had seen in his uncle what was written of in old storybooks as love. Inevitably, one rainy November afternoon 2 years ago, like a mountain stream, he simply passed on and away. It may have been age, it may have been wear. Des was not one to be easily felled by anything. He would have had to agree with it. It felt to Will like Des had just tightened his laces and moved on to a new country over yonder. Will missed his Uncle Des and thought of him often. Just then, Will heard the clang of distant church bells in some sort of royal-sounding peal, followed by 8 single clangs. It was that time again, 8 o'clock. He had slept in, not by much, but enough. When the schoolmaster made frequent reference to the late Master Templeton, it was, unfortunately, not a commentary of a long-gone relative of Will's. At times, the boy would simply get lost in his thinking. He'd sit and wonder at unknown things, frequently forgetting those things at hand, such as the time of day. Realizing he'd just been caught up in another good headful of daydreaming, it was nearly 8:30. He spilled out of bed, grabbed his socks from the floor where he'd dropped them the night before, jumped into his boots and raced downstairs. But in a momentary pause on the staircase, he was back up the stairs for his trousers. With his shirt successfully tucked in, he ran down the staircase and through the kitchen. It was Friday, and the day he and Jeff had planned to begin early before school, paying off their debt to society and Bill Noon's. But he'd gotten off to a late start, and the birds would have to wait until after school to get shot. Will's mother was hanging laundry in the yard. His father was already at work in his downtown shop. Fridays and Saturdays were big days for the head shearing business. Forks folks liked to be freshly shorn, scrubbed, and buffed for Sunday service. Mr. Templeton had plans for Will to follow in his lock-covered footsteps. Will was ordinarily expected there after school for sweeping and towel heating, but today was different. And how strange it was that his punishment was having to do more of that for which he was being punished. Hunting. He'd often wonder at what age adults become smarter than they were as kids. Twin Forks had a bridge that joined itself to the other side of town. As with so many things, Will preferred his own means of travel. One clear morning, nearly 2 springtimes ago, he'd wandered upstream, following the narrow of the river through the woods. It was there he came upon a broken skiff, hung up on the fray of an overturned tree, perched across the Wahani. Will balanced his way along the log to the small broken boat, its hull fractured on the left side. He loosed it from its loggy mire and hauled it up over the bank. Here he would cover his find with fallen branches and leafy debris. This was his claim. For the next 2 weeks, he slipped away at every chance and attended to the repair and saving of his sea-going sloop. With hammer and handsaw from his father's tool shed and scraps of wood he'd found along the river, he began his own education. When she seemed seaworthy, patched and tarred along the seams, he put his skills to the test. As long as he kept her away from tree branches and beaver dams, the way was his. And so that summer, as his spirit and the current moved him, he had come to learn a boatman's skills. As makeshift as it was enough. As a master of his own craft and a king of his own floating empire, he charted the 7 seas, forded every stream, and reached the Northwest Passage, all in his own backyard. The river's edge led to a patch of land that eventually raised and rolled to a field that separated his parents' house and civilization in general from the Wahani. That summer the path became well-trodden and well-loved by a boy fish out of water. He supposed the best part of his watery excursions was neither the boat nor the ambling river. It just seemed to him like the safest place to be. Just keeping out of the way of adults was a freedom he'd not known while landlocked and within their custodial reach. William didn't know much of the world, but he knew for sure that there was a lot more happening and swirling around within people than is ever spoken. The lad was routinely told he was too young for some things, too old for other things. He asked too many questions, and he felt to be continually making waves on land. Yes, sir, just laying under the honest sun while the clear, friendly river bobbed and floated under his hull was his solution to a town full of brothers and sisters, grabbers and twisters. Of course, he was a lot younger last summer, and a year is a significant amount of time when you've only had a handful of them. Down the hill at the river's edge was a lone willow tree, hanging like a great lion's head, sipping the cool stream. It was here that he stowed his skiff under the wave and weep of mane, grasses, and brush. He preferred using his boat to visit the east side of town to see Jeff and his sister. Yes, he had other reasons to purely enjoy paying calls on that household. Jeff and he were inseparable. Leah Asher, on the other hand, was as remote and untouchable as the 2 banks that remain on either side of the river. Even so, he could not see how one could exist without the other. She needed only ever do that one thing, unveil that little hinting smile of hers, and he was just as smote as smitten can be. It all began last fall, when leaves covered the Wahani River like rose petals on rich folks' baths. The winds picked up, and William, too, decided to explore the new world. There he was, like Uncle Des, landing his craft on the promised shores across the waters. He pulled and fastened his boat to boards hanging along the river's edge. He imagined there must have been a full-sized dock there at one time. The path that inclined to the street must have once been used by those who have since left it to nature. On his way up, Will picked up a sturdy-looking stick nearly as tall as he. He'd heard that mountain climbers used walking sticks over in green and hilly Europe. Twin Forks had its share of Dutch and German settlers, but he'd never seen them wearing hosen or climbing with sticks. They were, however, from time to time on holidays and frothy weekends, known to sing in foreign tongue. This he enjoyed hearing, it being so different and happy-sounding. And so, in exploration, Will was in his element. The incline led to the oil-dark gravel of the train yards. The nearest buildings had a surface of soot and grime entrusted to their wooden walls as a lacquered, layered memory of trains since passed. He kept out of sight and made his way to the street. The neighborhood bore a toughened resemblance to the yards. The houses looked older than surely they were, and not in that charming historical way. William kept moving. Several blocks deep into the east, he knew he had come to what was called the other side of town. It was late Saturday afternoon, and the sun was just past its prime, though not yet inclined to set. Just before the even, when shadows lengthened and the light turned sweet, the scene before him became suddenly darker. he came upon a group of boys. They looked likely his age, though straining to appear older in ways that accompany the worst of adults. Even from his distance, he could tell that they were up to no good. There's no hiding a hungry animal when it discovers warm blood and fresh prey. A smaller boy, differently but well-dressed, with a cap on his head like a half-moon, was caught in their midst. The circle of assailants suddenly closed on him. They shouted words, names mostly, that Will did not recognize. He did recognize the way they had said them. He had seen it before, with crows, when one of them falls to injury, infirmary, or just out of favor. Such a gathering is known for good reason as a murder. This mob of crows taunted the boy, provoked him to react, and threw pebbles at him, at first in cowardly sport, then in anger. The dark brood of them were barely 30 yards ahead. They hadn't seen Will or his walking stick. He maintained his pace. They quickened theirs. Arms began swinging and words became shouts. Will knew not what it was about, except that it was wrong. It was now or never. With a scream, he bolted and began waving the stick overhead like he meant to scythe a ripe and ready field. The startled lot turned their faces, mouths gaping, but no words came out. They looked like 6 statues standing there, pale and pie-faced, not knowing what was happening. Actually, neither did Will. He was hoping they would do something before he reached them and had to make good on his threat. He took a full breath and yelled, "Open the key! Open the key!" He drove head-on into the wall of them, holding his stick sideways like a great paddle, knocking down 4 of them, not including himself and the middle boy. The cloud of dust and grit sent up from the dirt road added to the confusion. The would-be coyotes then lost their appetite for odd duck and broke rank in 4 directions. Will chased the last one for a half block just to keep the threat alive, all the time screaming his Indian holler. When the dust began to settle and the assailants, unsettled, were still in flight, he returned to the boy, who was likewise ready to take cover. "Hey, it's all right," Will exclaimed, trotting back to the battle scene. "I'm not full of rabies or anything. Looked like you could use a friend there." "Yes, I guess so, thank you," said the boy. "You speak English. You aren't an Indian." "No," Will laughed. "But I figured if I'd have walked up as the son of a hairstyler, they'd have picked on me too. Are you okay? What was all that about? Why the stones?" "Oh," the boy began. "It was just any excuse to let into me. It's because of what I am." The boy hesitated, uncertain of how long this fledgling ally would last. My family is kind of different. We don't do things like go to church, like everyone else. Anyway, those bullies seem to forever look for someone to pick on who's more of an outcast than they are. I'm popular for that." The boy had not, until now, realized his social standing in the community. At that moment, he knew not whether to laugh or simply resign himself. But today was different. Maybe things could change. He turned to Will. "You know, no one's come to help me before. I just want to thank you." Will smiled in understanding, and they began to walk down the pebbled street. The boy looked surprised, more at this strange new fellow than the strange old pecking order into which his clan had been slotted. "I was just returning, on my own, though a little late, well, actually quite late," he paused, "from the synagogue. I'm an Israelite, you see." Will gave no reaction to either word, and the boy continued. "Those boys would never have bothered me if I was with my family, but it's the stray sheep that the wolves attack. They said I was a heathen and began throwing the stones at me. I'm sure they didn't intend to perform a real stoning." He paused. "Of me? At least I don't think so, but it would have gotten uglier if you hadn't have come when you did. Where did you come from, anyway? I've never seen you before." "Oh, I'm just over here exploring the wild country," said Willie, with a smile in his voice. "It was just luck that we met when we did. But let's keep moving. They'll probably run out of steam and head back to see what that wild Indian attack was all about." The boy agreed. "Oh, by the way, what was that fierce Indian war cry you were shouting?" Will smiled to himself again. "Well," he hesitated and looked to each side, "that's just something I've picked up in my exploring." The two pressed on, the boy with his handful of books and the brave Indian with his European walking-stick. Will didn't see the need in telling him the fierce war call was the Shawnee word for turnip. He had banked on the boys not knowing Shawnee either. "Hey, I haven't even asked your name," said the scholarly lad. William Templeton. At your service." He'd heard that phrase once and was hoping for just the opportunity to use it. "Well, hello, William. Hello to you, my friend." They stopped walking, turned, and looked at each other squarely and shook hands as brothers newly found. "Well, Will, if you ever find yourself in need of a friend, I hope I'll be there to help you out, too. I'm Geoffrey. Jeff, that is, Jeff Asher." They walked on the remaining blocks till reaching Geoffrey's home. The neighborhood had decidedly improved. Eventually, they stopped at a 2-story brick house with white wooden trim and a fine front porch extending its length. Flower baskets hanging at regularly spaced intervals adorned the front. The door was red and solid-looking, with a curved top and a gold handle. Will felt like he was trespassing and would be shooed away at any moment. But he was welcome thus far. Things became more curious. Before entering, Geoffrey kissed his hand and touched a small golden container, the size of a man's snuff-box, fixed just right of the door frame. Will didn't ask. Jeff opened the door for his guest. Will at once turned around for a moment, as if having second thoughts, only to double back and lean his trusty walking-stick aside the porch swing. The two boys grinned and walked inside. The reception area adjoined the living room and looked like any other, though finely appointed. They approached two figures who sat across from each other. Between them sat a polished dark brown wooden table upon which lay an open book. The couple were in mid-discussion when Jeff interrupted. "Excuse me, Father, Mother. I would like you to meet someone." "Yes, Geoffrey?" his father inquired, a little surprised to see a stranger in his living room, especially on the Sabbath. "Father," Jeff began, "just moments ago on the way home, I was attacked by a gang of boys." The two sat up a little straighter. Jeff recounted the story, and they all listened in astonishment. Jeff most of all to the words he heard himself speak. When all was said, the longest moment passed in the silence of mixed emotion. Finally the man, one Sheldon Ephraim Asher, arose in the stilled parlor, walked directly to this stranger boy, looked down into his unknown eyes, extended his hand, and clasped the boy's elbow with his other. His thick gray beard cracked open, and he spoke. "You are welcome in my home, William, and you are a friend to my family." Relieved smiles from all then lit the room, as names and handshakes were exchanged. With the story recounted and hands offered, it seems, Will had made an impression on this side of the river. At home, those who had known him all his life oft looked down on him. Here, folks he'd just met strangely respected him. Once again, life is curious. Mrs. Asher suggested tea and a sort of cookie, unfamiliar to Will, but, as it would turn out, no less delicious a payment. Just as she slipped past the doorway for the kitchen, Will turned his face back to the parlor and the men, when in the corner of one eye a vision flashed. Immediately, he turned back to see crossing below the lintel and standing silently the most beautiful girl he had ever seen or imagined. She stood as elegant simplicity, both exquisitely straight and curved at the same time, her hair dark and thick and full, tied atop her head with a plain white ribbon. 3 slender silken locks curled down alongside her oval, unblemished face. If cream is the purest of white, and summer peaches the sweetest of earth's offerings, surely the two had met in the making of this maiden. Her left hand rested on the doorway, fingers lithe and slender as if holding an object of the highest display and most delicate of touch. She spoke not a word, as visions seldom do, and moved nary a flick from that poised appearance, with lips closed, but not tightly, their corners lifted ever so slightly and serenely, in a smile that would slay will, then and in all future times. "Oh, William," said Jeff, "I'd like you to meet my older sister, Leah." For William Harrison Templeton, the world would never be the same.